The translation work came in on a Tuesday afternoon, not through my usual channels, not from corporate clients or publishing houses that had built relationships with me over the past 5 years. This arrived through a discreet email with an untraceable sender, offering $5,000 for 2 days of work on a manuscript I wasn't allowed to discuss. I emailed back within the hour and asked for delivery details. The amount was generous enough to make me pause, generous enough to make me suspicious, but my bank account was speaking louder than my caution. I'd become someone who translated fragments of dead languages for wealthy collectors. That's what my life had narrowed to by 28. A woman in an apartment that was clean but impersonal, surrounded by dictionaries and reference materials, moving between assignments without building any real connections. The work paid better than most jobs required an education in, but it never demanded anything of me beyond accuracy and discretion. I was good at both because I'd learned early that staying invisible was safer than being seen. The manuscript arrived by courier Wednesday morning. I signed for it, set it on the table, and made coffee before I opened the envelope. The seal wasn't new. The edges had frayed from handling. It was old. Genuine old. Not the manufactured antiquity that sometimes crossed my desk. The paper felt fragile under my fingers. The handwriting flowing in Sicilian dialect that made my chest tighten unexpectedly. I recognized some words. The structure of certain phrases. Because they lived in my memory, whether I wanted them there or not. My grandmother Lucia had been the keeper of these rhythms. She'd arrived at our house when I was 13, after my mother died. Cancer had eaten through her over 6 months, and my father couldn't manage a grieving child and an empty marriage. So when Lucia knocked on our door, he let her stay. She brought kitchen smells with her, and stories, and a voice that carried an accent that made even English sound like poetry. She taught me Sicilian the way she taught me to make pasta from scratch, not through formal instruction, but through immersion, through repetition, through the assumption that some things were inherited rather than learned. You carry the blood in you, she'd said once, her weathered hands guiding mine as I stirred sauce on the stove. Even when you don't speak it, even when you try to forget, the language remembers you. That was the thing about Lucia. She spoke in permanence, as if blood and language were forces that couldn't be negotiated with or abandoned, no matter how much distance you put between yourself and where you came from. She died 7 years ago. Cancer, like my mother. Like there was some curse written into the Marino family line. I was 22 when she went, and I kept her things in a box under my bed because I couldn't figure out what to do with them. Letters in her handwriting, photographs faded to the color of old newsprint, and a small book of prayers she'd copied out by hand. That book was what I reached for when I opened the translation file Wednesday morning. One prayer in particular appeared in both documents. The same sequence of words, the same intention behind them, translated across decades and geography. I read through it 3 times to be certain, my hands trembling slightly as I worked through the archaic phrasing, the religious imagery that mixed Catholic tradition with something older, something that spoke of protection and bloodlines, and things that transcended normal prayer. This can't be coincidence, I said aloud to my empty apartment, then immediately felt foolish for speaking into the silence like that. But it was the only thought that made sense. The prayer Lucia had taught me, the one she'd whispered during thunderstorms and during her final days in the hospital, was part of this manuscript that some stranger had paid me thousands of dollars to translate. I tried to work through the rest of the document with professional focus. Translation required a certain detachment, a distance between myself and the material, but my concentration kept fracturing. That one prayer kept pulling my attention back like a current. By Thursday evening, I hadn't slept. I'd called in sick to 2 routine projects and spent 36 hours moving between translation work and researching the manuscript's origins. The document itself offered few clues about authorship or provenance. It appeared to be a collection of writings from sometime in the early 20th century, compiled by someone with significant knowledge of Sicilian spiritual traditions. But there was nothing that explained how Lucia came to have that specific prayer, or why someone would pay this much money to have it translated now. The weight of not knowing was suffocating. All my life I'd tried to build something separate from my family history, something that was entirely mine. I'd chosen a career that dealt in precision and accuracy, which felt like the opposite of everything connected to my grandmother and the grandmother before her. Lucia had hinted at things without ever explaining them completely. She'd speak about family in ways that suggested depth and complexity I wasn't allowed to access. She'd use phrases like the old ways and what we protect, without clarifying what we meant or what required protection. Tuesday night, I told myself I needed to move the translation work forward. I told myself I needed to clear my head. What I actually needed was to feel close to something, to someone, to any part of the history that had shaped me without my consent. The church was 6 blocks from my apartment. I'd started going to St. Anthony's years ago, not from religious conviction, but from a need that I didn't fully understand. Lucia had taken me there once when I was younger, and something about the space had remained with me afterward. The way light moved through the stained glass, the scent of candles and old stone, the feeling that time moved differently inside those walls. I went on a Tuesday evening because that was when Lucia had taken me. I'd fallen into the habit of going on Tuesdays, sometimes just for 20 minutes, sitting in the back pews while other people prayed. I'd never been particularly religious. I didn't believe in divine intervention or salvation. But I believed in ritual, in the way repetition could create meaning even when the words themselves felt hollow. That particular Tuesday night, I was alone in the prayer section, just me and the altar candles, and the weight of that translation work pressing against my thoughts. I knelt without planning to, my knees meeting cold stone, and I found myself speaking words in Sicilian that I hadn't spoken aloud since my grandmother's funeral. The prayer came back to me perfectly, every syllable, every inflection, every pause that gave the words their particular power. I wasn't thinking about what I was saying. My body seemed to remember what my conscious mind had tried to forget. The words felt like they were moving through me rather than being generated by me, ancient and necessary, and completely separate from the small life I'd built in Boston. My voice was barely audible, nothing more than a whisper that dissolved into the silence of the church. But in that moment, kneeling alone with my grandmother's prayer resurrecting itself in my mouth, I felt something shift, not dramatically, nothing visible from the outside, but inside, something that had been locked away for years suddenly seemed permeable. I was so focused on the sensation of speaking the words that I didn't hear him enter, didn't notice that someone else had come into the church until I finished the prayer, until I lifted my head and felt the weight of being observed. The realization of it moved through me like cold water. Someone was there. Someone had heard. I didn't turn around immediately. Part of me wanted to pretend that the presence I sensed wasn't real, that I was projecting, that my own intensity around the prayer had created the feeling of another person's attention. But that wasn't how the world worked. If you felt watched, you were being watched. That was the first thing Lucia had taught me about survival. I rose from my knees slowly, steadying myself against the pew in front of me. The church seemed smaller suddenly, more intimate in a way that wasn't comforting. The candlelight threw shadows across the empty rows, and somewhere in those shadows was the person who had heard my grandmother's prayer emerge from my mouth. I turned. The church appeared empty. The person I'd sensed so clearly just moments before had vanished, or perhaps had never existed outside of my own heightened state. But the feeling of being seen remained, clinging to me like the scent of candle wax. Someone had been there. I was certain of it. And they had heard something they shouldn't have. Franco Ravellini maintained his rituals with the precision of a man who understood that discipline was the only thing separating him from the chaos that lived in his bloodline. Every Tuesday night, without exception, he entered the St. Anthony's and knelt in solitude. It wasn't piety that drove him. It was inheritance. His mother, Margarita, had taught him that faith, when practiced correctly, was armor. Not against bullets or law enforcement or rival organizations. Against the hollowing effects of power. Against the slow erosion of whatever humanity he'd been born with before his grandfather decided he had other purposes. Margarita had died when he was 17. Cancer that moved through her body like a thief, stealing pieces of her until there was nothing left but determination to make sure Franco understood one thing before she went, that some rituals mattered more than others. She'd taught him a prayer that had been in their family for generations, a prayer that his grandfather had designed specifically for the Ravellini line. It combined old Sicilian blessings with intentions that reflected their values, their code, protection against enemies, protection against the corruption that came with absolute power, loyalty to family above all other considerations. Franco had been reciting that prayer every Tuesday for 15 years, alone in this church, no one knowing except his closest confidants. It was the one space where he wasn't required to perform leadership, where he could simply be a man trying to maintain connection to something beyond the violence that defined his life. This particular Tuesday was supposed to be routine. Franco had meetings scheduled until late afternoon, problems emerging within the organization that required his attention. The Verciani family had been testing boundaries again, sending signals that they believed territory in Boston was negotiable. 3 weeks ago, an attack on one of his warehouses. 2 weeks ago, infiltration attempts at his import business. Roberto had warned him that escalation was coming, that this wasn't posturing anymore, but genuine threat assessment. Franco had listened to the reports in his office on the top floor of a building that officially housed corporate finance operations. He'd made decisions that would ripple through the city in ways that law enforcement would eventually attribute to gang violence or organized crime, never understanding the precise architecture of Franco's choices. Then, as the afternoon faded into evening, he'd felt the familiar pull toward the church. It wasn't logical. Leaving his office when the organization was under pressure seemed like the wrong decision. The indulgence of a man who couldn't maintain focus. "I need to step away," he'd told Roberto, his closest associate, a man who had been with him for 25 years and knew his patterns better than anyone. Roberto had frowned slightly, but he didn't protest. That was the arrangement between them. Roberto handled the practical aspects of Franco's life, the security details, the contingencies, but he respected the Tuesday ritual as untouchable. "I'll have the car waiting," Roberto had said, and Franco had left the office, moving through the building with the casual authority that came from ownership, passing employees who looked at him with fear mixed with respect. None of them knew what he actually was. As far as the corporate structure was concerned, he was just another man in an expensive suit, someone who made decisions about money and operations. The church smelled like it always did. Candles and stone and age. Franco moved through the entrance and into the prayer section, heading toward his usual spot. The space was empty. Just him and the flickering light from the votive candles, and the particular silence that churches maintained. A silence that felt separate from the rest of the world. He was preparing to kneel when he heard it, a voice so quiet that at first he thought he'd imagined it. But no, it was real. Someone else was there. A woman, he realized as he oriented toward the sound. She was kneeling several rows forward, her head bowed, her voice barely audible. She was speaking Sicilian. Franco went absolutely still. His body understood before his mind processed what he was hearing. The dialect was exact, the inflection proper. Not Italian, not Sicilian as it was spoken by tourists or academics or people trying to reconstruct their heritage. This was real Sicilian, the kind that came from blood rather than study. She continued speaking. And then came the words that made Franco's entire nervous system activate as if an electrical current had run through him. His prayer. His family's prayer. The exact sequence of words that he'd been reciting for 15 years. That his mother had taught him. That his grandfather had created specifically for the Ravellini line. Words that were supposed to be known only to members of his family. Franco found himself moving without deciding to move. Drawn forward like a predator recognizing something it needed to understand. The woman was completely absorbed in her prayer, unaware of his presence. She was blonde, younger than he was, dressed in simple clothes that suggested a life without significant wealth. Her hands were folded in her lap, her posture suggesting genuine vulnerability rather than performance. When she finished the prayer, she did something that stopped Franco's breath. She spoke the ancestral names, the continuation that came after the main prayer, the part that only true family knew. She said the names in Sicilian, honoring the lineage the way she'd been taught, the way that tradition dictated. Franco was looking at a ghost, or at a piece of his history that had somehow manifested in physical form. He backed away carefully, moving toward the exit without drawing attention. His mind was fractured into multiple simultaneous realities. This shouldn't be possible. The prayer was internal to his family, protected information that had never left the circle of blood. Yet here was a woman in a church in Boston, speaking his mother's words like they were her own inheritance. He exited the church without acknowledging her presence, moving back into the night air where Roberto was waiting with the car. Franco climbed into the back seat and instructed Roberto to drive, not toward his office, but toward one of the safe houses he maintained throughout the city. His hands were shaking slightly, which he recognized as unusual. Franco didn't shake. He didn't allow his body to respond to surprise or shock or confusion. "There's a woman in the church," Franco said without preamble. Blonde. Late 20s. She was reciting our prayer. Roberto's hands tightened on the steering wheel. His expression in the rearview mirror became carefully neutral, but Franco could see the calculation happening. Roberto understood exactly what this meant. The prayer was secret. It shouldn't exist outside their circle. What did you want me to do? Roberto asked. Professional. Specific. Find her, Franco said. Everything. Name, address, occupation, family history. I want to understand how she knows words that are supposed to be known only to us. Could be someone from the family? A distant relation? Possibly, Franco said, but his instinct was telling him something different. This woman had the look of someone completely separate from their world. She had the appearance of someone who lived in ordinary circumstances, who worked regular jobs, who didn't understand the complexity of what she carried inside her. Yet she knew the prayer with perfect accuracy. By Wednesday morning, Roberto had delivered preliminary information. Valentina Grant, 28 years old. Translator. No criminal record. No connections to organized crime that were immediately apparent. Her mother was deceased. Father unknown. Absent since her birth. Her last identifiable family member was a grandmother named Lucia Marino, who had died 7 years prior. The name Marino struck Franco like a physical blow. Marino. That was the family name of his grandfather's wife. The connection had been lost generations ago, when certain family members chose to leave that life behind, when they married outside the structure and created distance. Franco had been perhaps 8 years old when his grandfather mentioned that the Marino line had essentially vanished from their world, that they'd made the choice to be ordinary. But here was a woman who carried that family name in her bloodline. A woman who knew their prayer. A woman who seemed to exist completely outside their world. Franco spent Wednesday evening unable to concentrate on business. He found himself requesting security footage from the church, watching the video of Valentina kneeling in prayer, hearing her voice through inadequate audio, watching her mouth move around words that connected him to his mother, to his grandfather, to something he'd thought was permanently severed. He was obsessed. He recognized it as obsession, acknowledged it as dangerous, and did absolutely nothing to stop it. By Thursday, Roberto had delivered a comprehensive file. Valentina's entire life laid out in documents and photographs and surveillance reports. She lived alone. She had few connections. She worked as a translator, which explained her language skills. She spent her evenings in her apartment, or at the church. She visited a Catholic bookstore on Thursdays. She occasionally spent time at a coffee shop on Charles Street. She's clean, Roberto reported. No criminal associations. No connections to rival families. As far as I can tell, she has no idea about organized crime or any of our world. Then how does she know the prayer? Franco had demanded, though he knew Roberto had no answer to that question. That evening, Franco made a decision that surprised him with its impulsiveness. He instructed Roberto to continue surveillance on Valentina Grant. Not invasive surveillance, just observation. Just enough to understand who she was, what her patterns were, where her life intersected with his in ways that shouldn't have been possible. He justified it as security concern. If she knew information that was internal to his family, she could be a vulnerability. Rival families might try to use her. He needed to understand the scope of risk. He was lying to himself, and he knew it. But the lie was easier to live with than the truth, which was that Franco Ravellini had heard something in a church on a Tuesday night that had fundamentally altered his perception of what was possible in his life. He'd heard proof that his family extended beyond the boundaries he'd accepted, that there were threads connecting him to people he'd never met, that the past he'd assumed was closed off was somehow bleeding back into his present. By Friday, Roberto had delivered preliminary surveillance notes compressed into summary form. Her routine was precise and predictable. Every Tuesday at the church, every Thursday at the bookstore and coffee shop. Workdays spent at her apartment. Weekends involved modest activities, nothing that suggested she had significant relationships or social connections. She lived like someone who had chosen isolation, which resonated with something Franco recognized in himself. They were similar in that way, both living small lives inside larger systems, both carrying weight that didn't get discussed or acknowledged. Franco didn't need to invent anything. The manuscript was already moving through his corporate channels before that church night. After hearing the prayer, he let the cued assignment reach Valentina and used it as a clean, professional bridge. It was a real document with real value. The only new part was his decision to step closer. When Roberto delivered the commission details to Valentina through the corporate channels, Franco found himself calculating timelines, considering how to approach her, whether she might recognize his name, or make connections that would complicate everything. He'd never done anything like this before, allowed impulse to direct his decisions. His entire life had been about control, about careful planning, about anticipating variables and eliminating uncertainty. Valentina Grant represented complete uncertainty, and Franco found that he wanted to step into that uncertainty rather than avoid it, which terrified him in ways that actual violence never did. Roberto Giardoni worked with the methodical precision of a man who had spent 25 years understanding how information moved through the world. He began his search on Thursday morning, pulling digital threads that connected to Valentina Grant through various databases and informant networks. By Friday afternoon, he had the preliminary file. By Saturday morning, he had refined it down to its essential components. Valentina Marie Grant, he reported to Franco in the private office that overlooked the Boston Harbor. 28 years old, born in this city, mother deceased when subject was 10 years old. Cancer. Father listed as unknown on birth certificate. No contact with subject since infancy. Current occupation is freelance translation work, specializing in rare languages and historical documents. Franco listened without interrupting, his gaze fixed on the photograph Roberto had obtained through security camera footage from the church parking lot. It showed Valentina in daylight, leaving the building after her prayer. She looked smaller outside the church, less luminous, but her face carried the same intensity that had struck him during her prayer. "Where does she live?" Franco asked. "Apartment building on Pinckney Street, 4th floor. She's been there for 3 years, pays rent on time, has minimal social connections, works from her residence most days. Regular patterns suggest highly structured lifestyle. Family, grandmother, Lucia Marino, deceased 7 years ago. That's the only identifiable family member in her recent history. Before that, records get fragmentary. The grandmother came to live with her when subject was 13. Mother's side of the family. The Marino name appears in immigration records from 1955, but tracking the lineage beyond that becomes difficult. Franco's hand stilled on the desk. Marino, the name that had supposedly disappeared from his family's orbit decades ago, that his grandfather had mentioned only once, in a way that suggested the connection was severed intentionally. "How much do we know about Lucia Marino?" Franco asked. Roberto consulted his notes. Lucia Marino, born 1928 in Palermo, Sicily. Immigrated to United States in 1952. Married to an American man named Michael Grant. No record of her involvement in any criminal activities after arriving in America. Lived quietly. Died of cancer in 2018. Left her granddaughter Valentina her personal effects, which included correspondence and a personal prayer book according to records from the estate. A prayer book. Franco felt something crystallize in his understanding. Lucia Marino, granddaughter of the man who had been in his grandfather's circle, the family that had deliberately stepped away from their world. She had preserved the prayer. She had passed it on to her granddaughter, and that granddaughter had carried it forward, maintaining the ritual across the distance that had been deliberately created. "I want comprehensive surveillance established," Franco said. "Nothing invasive. I want to understand her patterns, her connections, anyone she interacts with regularly. 3-week observation minimum." "That's extensive," Roberto said carefully. "Is there a security concern?" "There might be," Franco said, which wasn't entirely a lie. She knows information that she shouldn't know. Before we understand what that means, we need to understand who she is. Roberto accepted this without further questioning. Loyalty meant accepting Franco's decisions even when they seemed unusual. By Monday of the following week, Roberto had established discrete observation points. Surveillance began at 6 in the morning, tracking Valentina's movements from the moment she left her apartment. Franco received daily reports. They became ritualistic, something he looked forward to in a way that disturbed him. Every afternoon, Roberto would deliver the summary. Valentina worked during the day, translating documents for various clients. She took breaks at specific times. She moved through her apartment in patterns that suggested routine built over years. Tuesday evenings, she went to the church. Thursday afternoons, she visited a Catholic bookstore and a coffee shop on Charles Street. She had no romantic relationships that were apparent. No close friendships. No social life beyond these structured activities. She was solitary in a way that Franco recognized, because it mirrored his own existence. They were both living small lives within their respective worlds, both carrying something that couldn't be easily articulated to people around them. "She's received a corporate assignment," Roberto reported on Wednesday of the second week. "Translation work. $5,000 for 2 days. The assignment came through intermediaries, and I've been tracing the chain. It's legitimate on the surface, but the structure suggests something else." "When will she receive the assignment?" Franco asked. "Tomorrow. Corporate courier service." Franco nodded, already imagining how he would structure the arrangement, how he would engineer a reason to meet her in person. He could send Roberto to verify the quality of her work initially, then arrive himself for a personal consultation. It would be professional. It would be legitimate. It would give him access to her space, her presence, the opportunity to understand what it meant that she carried his family's prayer in her mouth. By Thursday evening, the manuscript had been delivered. By Friday morning, Roberto had confirmed that Valentina was already engaged in the translation work, that she'd accepted the commission and begun immediately. She was working from her apartment, which meant she was accessible, which meant Franco could arrange his own contact without it appearing suspicious. The surveillance continued through week 3. Franco found himself requesting details that went beyond security necessity. He wanted to know what she ate for lunch. He wanted to know which book she took from the library. He wanted to know if she had any habits that suggested emotional distress or difficulty. These requests were unusual, and Roberto's eyebrows rose slightly at some of them. But he provided the information without commentary. "She visits the public library on Wednesday afternoons," Roberto reported. "Checks out books on Sicilian history, on Italian language guides, on family genealogy research. She appears to be trying to trace her family history. Of course she was. She carried their prayer in her body and didn't understand where it came from. She was searching for meaning in a lineage that had been deliberately hidden from her." "Anything else?" Franco asked. "She appears emotionally isolated," Roberto said carefully. "No indication of depression or crisis. But she moves through the world like someone who doesn't expect to connect with other people. She has money in her account but lives below her means. Her apartment is minimal. She has few possessions. It suggests someone who either values freedom or doesn't believe she deserves to be comfortable." Franco understood that state. He lived the same way, despite having access to unlimited resources. The money didn't matter when everything you owned could become evidence or leverage or a target for enemies. Comfort was a luxury reserved for people whose lives weren't inherently unstable. "I want to meet with her," Franco said on Friday of week 3. "Arrange something that looks professional. Roberto will make initial contact about the translation work verification. I'll follow up personally." "That's direct," Roberto said. "Are you sure that's the approach you want?" "I'm not going to maintain surveillance indefinitely," Franco said. "I need to understand what she is, what she knows, why she carries information that belongs to my family. And if she's dangerous? Then we'll discover that when we meet," Franco said, though he already knew with certainty that Valentina Grant wasn't dangerous. What she was a key, a piece of his history that had somehow found its way back to him. And Franco had spent too long in isolation to let that opportunity pass without reaching for it, regardless of the complications it might create. Roberto Giardoni's office was located in a building that officially housed import-export operations. The space was nondescript, professional, designed to deflect attention rather than attract it. But inside his private room, secured behind steel-reinforced doors and electronic locks, was a network of computer systems and filing cabinets that represented decades of accumulated intelligence. Roberto had built this infrastructure over 25 years because he understood something fundamental about power. Information was the foundation upon which everything else was constructed. He began his search on Thursday morning, pulling threads that connected through various databases. His hands moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, accessing records that weren't meant to be public. By early Friday afternoon, preliminary data had coalesced into something coherent. By Saturday morning, he had refined the investigation into a comprehensive file that he scheduled to deliver to Franco in person. The meeting happened in Franco's private office, located on the top floor of a building that appeared to house corporate finance operations, but was actually the nerve center of Franco's organization. Franco sat behind a desk constructed of dark wood, with windows overlooking the harbor. He was reading reports when Roberto entered, but he set them aside immediately, giving his full attention to the older man. "Valentina Marie Grant," Roberto began. placing the file on the desk. 28 years old. Born in Boston. Mother deceased when subject was 10. Cancer. Father listed as unknown on birth certificate. No contact record between subject and father since infancy. Franco listened without interrupting, his gaze fixed on the photograph that Roberto had included. It was taken from security footage outside the church, captured the moment Valentina had stepped into daylight. She appeared smaller in the photograph than she had seemed during prayer, more vulnerable, but her features carried the same quality of intensity that had struck Franco so profoundly. Current occupation is freelance translation work, Roberto continued. She specializes in rare languages, historical documents, linguistic analysis. Her client base includes private collectors, academic institutions, museum acquisitions departments. Income is irregular, but substantial. She appears to live below her means. The apartment she occupies costs approximately $1,200 per month. Her bank records indicate she could easily afford something more prestigious, but she chooses not to upgrade her living situation. How long has she lived there? Franco asked. 3 years. Minimal variation in her patterns suggests someone who has deliberately constructed stability, or someone who doesn't believe they deserve more. The psychological profile isn't immediately clear. Franco nodded slowly, understanding that assessment. He recognized that particular form of self-imposed limitation because he lived the same way, despite having access to virtually unlimited resources. Comfort was a liability in his world, a vulnerability that enemies could exploit. Family connections? Franco asked. Roberto pulled a secondary document from the file. Grandmother, Lucia Marino, deceased 7 years ago. That's the only identifiable family member in recent records. Before that, the genealogical trail becomes fragmented. The Marino name appears in immigration records from 1955, but historical documentation beyond that point is limited. Lucia Marino was born in 1928 in Palermo, Sicily. She immigrated to the United States in 1952. She married Michael Grant, an American citizen of Irish descent. No record of Lucia's involvement in criminal activity after immigration. She appears to have lived a quiet, ordinary life. Franco's hand stilled on the desk. Palermo, 1928. The date and location aligned with generational timing that would have placed Lucia Marino in proximity to his grandfather's circle. Marino, the name that had supposedly disappeared from his family's orbit decades ago, severed deliberately when certain family members chose to leave that life behind. What was her relationship with her granddaughter? Franco asked. Lucia came to live with Valentina when she was 13, following the death of Valentina's mother. According to neighbors, they were quite close. Lucia remained in the household until her death from cancer when Valentina was 22. Estate records indicate that Lucia left her granddaughter personal effects including correspondence and a personal prayer book. A prayer book. Franco felt something crystallize within his understanding. Lucia Marino had preserved it. She had maintained the connection across the deliberate distance that had been created. She had passed the prayer forward, ensured that the knowledge survived, even though the family connection had been severed. I want comprehensive surveillance established immediately, Franco said, his voice steady despite the intensity of what he was feeling. Nothing invasive. I want to understand her patterns, her daily movements, anyone she interacts with. 3-week observation minimum. Is there a security concern? Roberto asked carefully. The question was a formality. Roberto knew Franco wouldn't order surveillance without legitimate justification, but asking aloud maintained a certain professional boundary. She knows information that she shouldn't know, Franco said, which was technically accurate if incomplete. Before we understand the implications, we need to understand who she is. Roberto accepted this without further questioning. Loyalty meant accepting Franco's decisions, even when they seemed unusual or strategically questionable. He left the office with instructions to establish observation points and begin documentation of Valentina Grant's movements, activities, and connections. By Monday morning, discreet surveillance had been established at multiple locations. A man stationed across from her apartment building, another position near the coffee shop she visited on Thursday afternoons, a third assigned to monitor her workplace. Although she appeared to work primarily from her residence, Roberto received daily reports that he compiled into summaries for Franco's review. Franco found himself looking forward to these reports in a way that disturbed him. He recognized what was happening. He was obsessed. It was an unprofessional state for someone in his position, a vulnerability that could be exploited by rivals, a distraction that could compromise his judgment. He acknowledged this reality and did absolutely nothing to stop it. The daily summaries became ritualistic. Valentina worked during daylight hours, translating documents for various clients. She took breaks at specific intervals. She moved through her apartment with the precision of someone living according to established routines. Tuesday evenings, she attended St. Anthony's for approximately 90 minutes of prayer and reflection. Thursday afternoons, she visited a Catholic bookstore where she browsed for 30 to 40 minutes, then moved to the coffee shop where she sat alone, usually with a book, for another hour or so. She had no romantic relationships that surveillance could detect. No close friendships. No social life beyond these carefully structured activities. She was solitary in a way that Franco recognized and understood because it reflected his own existence. They were both living small lives within the parameters of their respective worlds, both carrying weight that couldn't be articulated to people around them, both moving through their days with deliberate precision. Franco's attention focused completely. Details? Translation work. $5,000 for 2 days of labor. The assignment came through corporate intermediaries, and I've been tracing the chain of custody. The structure is legitimate on its surface, but the architectural design suggests something else. Suggests that someone deliberately set up the assignment to be untraceable to its origin. When will she receive the assignment? Franco asked. Tomorrow morning. Corporate courier service. Franco nodded. By Thursday, the manuscript would be in her possession. By Friday, she would be engaged in translation work, extracting meaning from text that had survived centuries, rebuilding language and intention from fragments and deterioration. The irony wasn't lost on him. She would be translating his family's words, understanding his grandfather's intentions, processing the spiritual foundation that had shaped his life. I'm going to meet with her, Franco said. Arrange it as a professional consultation. Roberto will make initial contact about verification of work quality. I'll follow up personally. That's direct approach, Roberto said carefully, using the neutral tone of someone raising practical considerations without overstepping boundaries. Are you sure that's the strategy you want to implement? I'm not going to maintain surveillance indefinitely, Franco said. I need to understand what she is, what she knows, why she carries information that belongs to my family. Roberto accepted this without further argument. Loyalty meant trusting Franco's judgment, even when decisions seemed unusual or potentially problematic. By Friday afternoon, Roberto had made preliminary contact through corporate channels, notifying Valentina that a client representative might arrive for a personal consultation regarding the translation quality. The notification was professional, non-threatening, business standard. Franco spent Friday evening in his office, ostensibly reviewing the evening's reports, but actually visualizing what would happen when he finally met Valentina Grant in person. He imagined what she might say. He imagined how she might react when he revealed his identity. He imagined the moment when she understood that his appearance in her life was not coincidence, but destiny. By Saturday morning, Franco had made his decision. He would visit her apartment Monday evening. He would present himself as the corporate client. He would explain that he wanted to review the translation work personally to ensure quality standards. None of this would be technically false, but all of it would be incomplete truth, strategically presented to accomplish his actual objective, which was simply to be in her presence, to hear her voice, to understand how a woman he'd never met could carry his family's prayer in her mouth like it belonged there. Roberto arranged the meeting through intermediaries. By Monday afternoon, the appointment was confirmed. Valentina would be expecting a visit from a corporate client. She would be preparing her translation work for review. She wouldn't be preparing for the moment that would reshape the trajectory of her entire life, though that preparation would have been impossible in any circumstance. Franco dressed carefully Monday evening, not in the expensive Italian suits that he wore to business meetings, but in clothes that were still elegant, but less conspicuously wealthy. He wanted to present himself as someone successful, but not ostentatiously so. Someone who could blend into ordinary circumstances while maintaining an underlying presence that suggested power. Roberto drove him to Valentina's apartment building. The old brick structure stood on Pinckney Street, a neighborhood that had gentrified unevenly, where young professionals lived alongside families who had inhabited the area for decades. Franco climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, his heart moving in a rhythm that he found unfamiliar. He was nervous. That was unusual. Franco Ravellini didn't experience nervousness. He experienced calculation and decision and execution. But as he approached her apartment door, he felt something that resembled anxiety, a sense that stepping through the threshold of her space was going to irrevocably alter something fundamental about his understanding of his own life. The night after Franco left my apartment, sleep became an abstraction. I lay in darkness, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our encounter in precise detail. His face, his voice, the way he'd positioned himself with deliberate control, as though every movement had been calculated in advance. The revelation about his name hadn't been surprising exactly, but it had been transformative. It had reorganized how I understood the events that had led to his appearance in my life. Friday morning found me at my computer before 6 o'clock. The research began as casual internet searches and evolved into something more systematic. Franco Ravellini returned thousands of results, most of them vague business references or corporate documentation. But there were other articles too, buried in local news archives and law enforcement publications. Articles about organized crime in New England. References to his name alongside words like investigation and suspected and alleged. Photographs that showed him in contexts I hadn't anticipated, always surrounded by men in dark suits, always accompanied by an expression of controlled authority. I found myself reading about crime families and territory disputes and business operations that existed in worlds entirely separate from my own. The information was disturbing, not because it was shocking, but because it clarified something I'd been instinctively understanding since he'd walked into my apartment. Franco Ravellini wasn't a corporate client. He was someone dangerous, in ways that extended far beyond the physical realm. By Saturday morning, I hadn't slept more than 2 hours total. My hands trembled as I continued reading. My apartment felt smaller, the walls pressing inward. Every sound from the street seemed significant. Every notification on my phone triggered anxiety. I understood, in a way that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, that knowing what Franco was had changed the calculation entirely. It wasn't possible to unknow it. It wasn't possible to return to the moment before I'd understood. I made a decision Saturday afternoon that surprised myself with its irrationality. I hired a private investigator to locate my father. I knew it was desperate, knew it was likely futile, but I needed to understand something about my own history that might contextualize what was happening with Franco. The investigator was expensive, charging an hourly rate that consumed a significant portion of my translation income, but I provided him with what little information I possessed. My father's name, his approximate age, the knowledge that he'd disappeared in 1994. By Sunday evening, the investigator had sent preliminary information. Thomas Grant, my father, was alive and living in Connecticut under what appeared to be his original name. He'd relocated there in 1995, the year after I was born. He worked in insurance. He had never remarried. He had no criminal record. There was no indication that he'd ever been involved in organized crime. I drove to Connecticut Sunday night, which was probably insane. I drove 3 hours through darkness, following GPS directions to an address that represented the first concrete connection to my father that I'd ever attempted. His house was small, modest, situated on a quiet street where people who lived ordinary lives built quiet lives. I sat in my car outside his residence for 45 minutes before I found the courage to approach his door. Thomas Grant answered on the second knock. He was older than I'd imagined. His hair gray, his face carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying weight for decades. Recognition didn't flash across his features immediately, but confusion did. A woman standing on his porch at 10 o'clock on a Sunday night clearly wasn't an expected visitor. "My name is Valentina Grant," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm your daughter." His reaction was physical. His hands gripped the doorframe. His breathing changed. For a moment, I thought he might actually collapse. Then he stepped back, pulled the door open fully, and gestured me inside without speaking. The conversation that followed lasted until nearly 3 a.m. Thomas revealed everything with the kind of desperation that comes from holding secrets for decades and suddenly being given permission to release them. He told me about meeting my mother at a restaurant where she worked as a server. He told me about falling in love with someone whose family he didn't understand. He told me about the night that men came to his apartment and delivered a message that changed everything. "They didn't threaten me explicitly," he said, his voice hollow. "They just explained the situation. Explained that your mother came from a particular family with particular connections. explained that if I wanted to keep my daughter alive, I needed to disappear. Not from the country, not from Boston necessarily, but from her life completely. They said that my presence was a vulnerability. They said that if I loved you, I would leave. And you believed them? I asked. Though I already knew the answer, I had no reason not to believe them, he said. I wasn't naive, Valentina. I understood what they were, and I understood that they had the capacity to do what they threatened. So I left. I left your mother because I believed it was the only way to keep you safe. I've spent 28 years wondering if I made the right decision. Thomas described receiving word of my mother's death through indirect channels. Cancer, he'd been told, though he'd never confirmed it directly. He'd watched my life from a distance, through investigative reports that he'd hired over the years. He'd seen photographs of me entering my apartment building, going to work, attending church. He'd preserved those photographs in a box that he showed me, his hands shaking slightly as he turned each one. I wanted to contact you so many times, he said, but I was afraid that reaching out would endanger you, afraid that whoever had threatened me was still watching, still waiting to see if I'd violate the terms of my exile, afraid that you'd hate me for leaving. The conversation created a peculiar reconciliation. Not forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness required that he'd done something I could blame him for. And I understood now that he'd made a choice that was impossible to judge from the outside. He'd chosen my safety over his presence in my life. That was something I could respect, something I could process, something that recontextualized my entire understanding of abandonment. What's changed? Thomas asked, as morning light began filtering through his windows. Why now? Why have you searched for me now? I couldn't explain it completely. I couldn't tell him about Franco or the prayer or the surveillance, or any of the elements that had destabilized my carefully constructed equilibrium. Instead, I told him I was trying to understand my family, trying to understand the heritage that had shaped my life without my knowledge or consent. Monday evening, Franco appeared at my apartment door with flowers and chocolate. The flowers were lilies, pure white, and the chocolate was imported, expensive, chosen by someone who understood that details mattered. He looked different in my space during daylight hours, less predatory, more human, but there was still an intensity in his presence that made my breathing shallow. I placed you under surveillance, he said without preamble, without any attempt at softening the confession. I followed your movements for 3 weeks. I learned your patterns. I arranged for you to receive a translation assignment that would give me a pretext to meet you. I've been obsessed with you since the moment I heard you pray. That's what you need to know about me, Valentina. I don't do things halfway. When something interests me, I pursue it completely, regardless of the ethical complications. I should have been terrified. I should have asked him to leave, should have called the police, should have done any number of things that would have protected me from someone who just confessed to systematic surveillance. Instead, I listened to the vulnerability in his voice and recognized something of myself in the desperation beneath his confession. I'm offering you a choice, Franco said. A real choice. Not coercion. Not manipulation. I can disappear from your life completely if that's what you want. I'll ensure your safety. I'll provide financial support if you need it. I'll make this entire situation disappear as though it never happened. Or you can allow me to stay. To know you. To understand what brought you into my world. I could have chosen either option. I could have protected myself by rejecting him completely. Instead, I chose vulnerability over safety. I chose to allow him access to the parts of my life that I'd kept guarded for so long. I chose to step into uncertainty with someone dangerous. Someone whose world was fundamentally incompatible with my own. Someone whose obsession with me mirrored my growing obsession with understanding who he was and what his interest in my existence might mean. Stay, I said, the word barely audible. Tell me something true about yourself. Franco took a step closer. His hand reached out, fingers brushing against my jawline with careful intentionality. Everything about this is true, he said. My obsession with you. My need to understand how you know my family's prayer. My certainty that meeting you wasn't coincidence but destiny. All of it is completely true. That's what terrifies me most. I don't do well with things I can't control. And you, Valentina, are completely uncontrollable. The days following Franco's confession developed into a rhythm that felt simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary. He would arrive at my apartment in the evenings, sometimes directly from business meetings, other times after spending hours managing operations I didn't fully understand. We established a pattern of domestic intimacy that seemed contradictory to everything about who he was. He would cook occasionally, moving through my kitchen with surprising competence, while I worked on translations at the dining table. We'd sit in near silence, the kind of companionable quiet that only develops between people who have moved beyond the need for constant conversation. Franco began revealing his world in deliberate layers, each confession another brick in the structure of trust that was forming between us. He told me about his mother Margarita, how she had died when he was 17, how her death had coincided with his grandfather's decision to bring him directly into the family business. He spoke about violence without glorifying it, describing it as a practical tool in a world where practical tools were the only currency that mattered. "I've killed people," he said one evening, his voice completely neutral. "Not many. I'm strategic enough that I don't need to kill often. But I've done it. I've looked into someone's eyes and made the decision that their existence was incompatible with my organization's survival. That's something you should know about me." I understood that this was a test of some kind, a moment where I could express horror or judgment and fundamentally alter what was developing between us. Instead, I acknowledged his statement without condemning it. "I believe you," I said. "I don't think you're someone who lies about what he is." His expression shifted into something that resembled relief, as if my acceptance of his nature, without the complications of moral outrage, gave him permission to continue existing as he actually was, rather than as some sanitized version of himself. During these conversations, I processed my own understanding of my father Thomas with newfound clarity. I had visited him again, had spent entire weekends in Connecticut, allowing him to tell me the details of his life that had been shaped by fear and the need to protect me from circumstances he had never fully controlled. Thomas had shown me photographs of my mother, had described her with the kind of tenderness that comes from loving someone completely and then losing them. He had explained that my grandmother Lucia had been his only connection to my mother after their separation, and that Lucia had maintained the barrier between him and me with deliberate precision because she understood that the threat was real. "Your mother's family wasn't involved in criminal activity directly," Thomas had explained, his hands trembling slightly. "But they had connections. Lucia broke those connections deliberately when she married my father and immigrated to America. She thought she'd escaped it completely, but apparently there were people who didn't accept that she'd simply stepped away." The complexity of my family history was becoming comprehensible through Franco's presence in my life. He represented the world that my grandmother had fled, the traditions that she had preserved through prayer and language while actively rejecting their practical application. And I, somehow, had inherited both the spiritual legacy and the vulnerability that came with it. One evening in late November, Franco arrived at my apartment with visible tension in his shoulders. He moved through the space with less grace than usual, his movement suggesting something had disturbed his equilibrium. He kissed me briefly, then moved to the window and stood there looking out at the Boston skyline without speaking. "What happened?" I asked. "An attack on one of our warehouses," he said. "The Versiani family is escalating beyond the level of posturing we've been managing. This is becoming something more substantial. Is it serious?" The question felt naive even as I asked it, but I didn't know how to quantify threat in Franco's world. "It's manageable," he said, which seemed like a non-answer, "but it requires attention. I'm going to need to be away from here more frequently, sometimes for extended periods. You'll need to understand that my presence can't be constant." I understood then that our domesticity had existed in a kind of bubble, a space where I could temporarily forget that Franco existed within a complex structure of power and violence and territorial conflict. The attack on his warehouse was a reminder that this structure was always present, always demanding management and strategic response. Roberto appeared at my apartment the following Tuesday evening, which had never happened before. His arrival suggested that something had shifted in Franco's operational security protocols. Roberto stood in my living room with his characteristic professional demeanor, though I could detect something approximating concern beneath his carefully neutral expression. "Franco is occupied with operational matters," Roberto said. "He asked me to inform you that there may be escalated activity over the coming weeks. He wants you to be aware that your safety is a priority, but that his availability will be compromised." "Is he in danger?" I asked directly. Roberto considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "Franco is always in danger," he said. That's the nature of his position. But he has survived 32 years in this world through a combination of strategic thinking and the loyalty of people who are willing to sacrifice for him. I'm among them. So the danger is managed as much as it can be managed in circumstances like these. After Roberto left, I spent the night researching the Versiani family. Online information was limited but suggestive. They were described as a rival organization, based in New York, but attempting to expand territory into New England. They were allegedly involved in operations that ranged from traditional organized crime activities to more modern criminal enterprise. They were considered dangerous enough to warrant FBI attention, though law enforcement's effectiveness against organizations like them appeared limited. Franco called me at 3 a.m. His voice carried the particular quality of exhaustion that comes from making decisions with significant consequences. "I need you to understand something," he said without preamble. "My world is about to become more complicated. Wars don't resolve themselves quickly, and the Versiani situation appears to be developing into something that will consume significant time and resources. I don't want you to be caught in the crossfire of that. Not physically, but emotionally. Not because I don't want you in my life, but because I want you to have the option to remove yourself if this becomes too much. Are you offering me an exit?" I asked, hearing the vulnerability in my own voice. "I'm offering you reality," he said. "I'm offering you the truth that being connected to me means being connected to all of this. The violence, the complexity, the uncertainty. I know what I'm asking of you. And I want you to make that choice with complete information. I don't need to leave," I said. "I'm choosing to stay." There was silence on the line, the kind of silence that carries weight. "Then I need to move you somewhere safer," Franco said. "Somewhere that I can protect you more effectively. I have a house in the suburbs. It's secure. I want you to move there while this situation develops." The proposal should have terrified me. It should have triggered every instinct of self-preservation I possessed. Instead, I felt a strange sense of relief. Moving to Franco's secure location meant surrendering control, but it also meant surrendering the isolation that I'd maintained for so long. It meant accepting that I was no longer moving through the world alone, that someone with considerable resources had determined that my safety mattered enough to require extraordinary measures. "When?" I asked. "Monday," he said. "I'll have someone assist with your transition. Pack essentials. Don't worry about most of your possessions. The house has everything you'll need." That Friday evening, Franco appeared at my apartment for the last time in that space. He moved through the rooms with the deliberation of someone taking final photographs in his memory. He stood in front of the altar where I kept photographs of Lucia, studying the images like they might reveal secrets. "Your grandmother was remarkable," he said. "She preserved something that was supposed to be protected and secret. She did it anyway, maintained the connection across distance and deliberate severance. That took courage." "She was," I agreed. "I'm just now understanding how much." Franco pulled me close, his arms surrounding me with the kind of protective intensity that suggested he was preparing for a separation. "Once you move to the house, things are going to change. I won't be able to maintain the level of proximity we have now. There will be days where I'm completely absent. There will be decisions I'm making that you won't be informed about because the information would place you in danger. You're going to have to trust me through circumstances where trust is the only currency that matters." I nodded against his chest, understanding that we were entering a new phase of whatever this was. A phase where safety required sacrifice, where protection required distance, where love existed alongside danger in ways that I was only beginning to comprehend. The safe house existed in a state of controlled isolation. Located in the suburban reaches of Boston, where properties sat back from roads behind wrought iron gates and mature trees, it was a mansion disguised as understated wealth. From the outside, it appeared to be simply an expensive home owned by someone who valued privacy. Inside, the architecture revealed its true purpose. Reinforced windows that appeared decorative, but were constructed from materials designed to withstand significant force. Cameras positioned at strategic angles throughout the interior and exterior perimeter. Security systems integrated into walls in ways that were barely visible unless you knew what you were looking for. Franco had given me a tour on Monday morning before disappearing for meetings that would occupy his attention for the next 3 days. He'd shown me the kitchen, the library, the master bedroom that had windows overlooking a private lake that reflected gray November sky. Everything I could possibly need was provided. Food stocked in the refrigerator, books arranged on shelves, a workspace set up with computer systems and translation tools. "You won't be imprisoned here," he'd said, showing me the security panel that controlled the gate. "You can leave if you want to, but I'd prefer that you didn't. Not until the situation stabilizes." The situation didn't stabilize. By Wednesday, Franco arrived at the house with visible injury. His left shoulder was bandaged beneath his shirt, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone managing pain. I didn't ask what had happened. I understood that certain details would be withheld for my protection. That complete knowledge of his operations could create vulnerabilities. What struck me most was how he allowed me to see him injured. He didn't hide it or downplay it. He simply accepted my presence as he showered and changed, letting me help him into clean clothes, permitting my hands to touch the bandage with careful gentleness. It was an intimacy that transcended the physical. "How bad?" I asked. "Manageable," he said, which had become his standard response to any question about the severity of circumstances. "It'll heal. Everything heals eventually." Thursday evening, Franco's focus shifted partially toward me. He brought files into the library where I'd been working on routine translation assignments, spreading documents across the heavy wooden table. "I need your expertise," he said. "These are intercepted communications, Russian. I need to know what they say, but more importantly, I need context. I need to understand what they're planning." I examined the documents. They were photographs of written communications, some in Russian Cyrillic, some in English with Cyrillic notations. The vocabulary was military in nature, discussing movements and operations and strategic positioning. "This is complicated," I said. "Some of this is coded. They're not being completely explicit because they suspect their communications might be monitored. But you can interpret the subtext?" "Possibly," I said. "Give me time." I worked for 3 days straight, breaking only for sleep and meals. Franco provided me with reference materials and historical context about Russian criminal organizations. The communications began to cohere into something meaningful. They were discussing infiltration strategies, discussions of which of Franco's operations were vulnerable, plans for escalation. By Sunday evening, I had compiled a translation that painted a clear picture of the Versiani-Russian alliance's intentions. They weren't just attacking Franco's operations. They were systematically mapping his organizational structure with the goal of complete destabilization. "This is sophisticated," I told Franco as I presented my findings. "They're not acting rashly. They're conducting reconnaissance, understanding your vulnerabilities before they make a major move, which means we have time," Franco said, though his expression suggested that time was a limited commodity. "Thank you. This information changes our strategic calculations significantly." He kissed me briefly, then was gone again, pulled back into meetings and decisions that would shape how his organization responded to the threat developing around us. Tuesday evening arrived with the particular quality of quiet that November carried into New England. Franco appeared unexpectedly, which had become rare. His absence had been extended, his presence becoming something I'd learned not to anticipate. But on Tuesday, at exactly 7 o'clock, he entered the safe house carrying the weight of 3 weeks of conflict. "I want to pray," he said without preamble. "I want to pray with you." I understood immediately what he was asking. He wanted to recite the prayer together, to share the spiritual practice that connected him to his family, and connected me to mine through the blood inheritance I was only beginning to understand. We knelt together on the library floor, the space we'd come to occupy during our evenings together. The fireplace cast dancing shadows across the room. Franco's hands found mine in the darkness. "I learned this prayer from my mother," he said softly. "She taught it to me when I was 7 years old. She said that it was designed to protect those who belonged to our family, that it carried power because it was spoken with intention. I stopped believing in that power when she died. I thought the prayer had failed because she got sick anyway. But I was wrong." "How do you know?" I asked. "Because I'm still alive," he said. "Because you're here. Because somehow, across generations and deliberate severance, you carry this prayer in your blood." The power wasn't about preventing death. It was about maintaining connection across distance and time. We recited the prayer together. His voice moved beneath mine, the Sicilian words creating harmony that was almost musical. When we finished, Franco remained kneeling beside me, his hand gripping mine with intensity that suggested he was anchoring himself to something real. "My mother died of cancer," Franco said, "when I was 17. It consumed her over months. I watched her deteriorate, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. She was the strongest person I knew, and the disease didn't care about strength. I felt my chest tighten. My mother died of cancer too, I said, when I was 10. I barely remember her face now. I have photographs, but those aren't the same as actual memory. Franco turned to me then, understanding crystallizing in his expression. You understand loss then. You understand what it means to have something essential taken before you're ready to let it go. I do, I said. He pulled me close, his arms surrounding me with the kind of protective intensity that had become his physical language. We stayed like that for hours, kneeling in front of the fire, holding each other in the way that people do when they've recognized in each other something fundamental about survival and grief. Later that evening, as we lay together in the master bedroom, Franco traced patterns across my skin with careful fingers. His touch was exploratory, gentle in a way that contrasted with the controlled violence that typically characterized his physical presence. He moved slowly, giving me opportunities to withdraw, to establish boundaries. Instead, I drew him closer, accepting the vulnerability that he was offering. We made love with an intimacy that transcended physical connection. It was an acknowledgement of shared trauma, a recognition that we were both people shaped by loss and the need to survive circumstances beyond our control. When he held me afterward, his breathing gradually slowing as sleep approached, I felt something settle within me, a sense of belonging that I'd searched for my entire life and never quite found until this moment. Don't leave me, I said into the darkness. The words escaped before I could reconsider them. I can't make that promise, Franco said with brutal honesty. The war with Versiani might require sacrifices that I can't anticipate, but I can promise that you're the reason I'm fighting to survive it. Everything I do now is calculated toward creating a future where I can exist in this space with you without constant threat. It was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to me, precisely because it was devoid of false promises. Franco wasn't offering me certainty. He was offering me his commitment to try, his willingness to sacrifice, his genuine desire to build something that transcended the violence of his world. By Wednesday morning, he was gone again, pulled back into operational necessities, but he left something behind. A handwritten letter placed on my pillow, expressing in words what he'd struggled to articulate in conversation. He wrote about recognizing in me something that he thought had been permanently severed from his capacity to feel. He wrote about his mother, and about his fear that his existence would inevitably damage anyone who allowed themselves to love him. He wrote about choosing to believe that perhaps his mother had been right about the power of the prayer, and that perhaps Valentina Grant had been sent into his life specifically to remind him why survival mattered. The war reached its crescendo during the third week of December. Franco had been absent for increasingly extended periods, arriving at the safe house only in brief intervals to shower, change clothes, and consume reports that Roberto delivered with mechanical precision. The tension in his shoulders had become permanent, his movements suggesting someone operating on depleted reserves of both physical stamina and emotional energy. Valentina remained at the safe house, continuing her translation work, but with a new intensity of purpose. The Russian communications that Franco needed interpreted had become her singular focus. She worked methodically through the intercepted messages, recognizing patterns that suggested the Versiani alliance was approaching their final operational phase. The organization wasn't simply attacking Franco's territory. They were executing a coordinated strategy designed to dismantle his infrastructure systematically. By the 15th of December, Valentina had compiled a comprehensive translation that outlined the Russian organization's complete assault plan. She presented the findings to Franco during one of his rare appearances at the safe house, spreading the documents across the library table where they'd spent so many intimate evenings. They're planning a coordinated strike, Valentina explained, pointing to specific passages she'd translated. 3 separate operations scheduled for simultaneous execution. Here, financial operations. Here, territorial consolidation. And here, direct confrontation with your leadership structure. They're not leaving anything to chance. This is designed to be decisive. Franco studied the translations with the focus of someone whose survival depended on understanding details. When? He asked. The communications suggest the strike is planned for next week, December 22nd. They believe your organization will be compromised by holiday operations and reduced vigilance. Franco nodded slowly. They're strategically sound. Holiday periods do create vulnerability. He looked at Valentina with an expression that carried gratitude mixed with something approximating awe. You've given us the information we need to neutralize this threat before it develops into full conflict. What happens now? Valentina asked. Now I ensure that we survive, Franco said, and that you understand that everything I've done, everything I do moving forward, is calculated toward creating a future where survival doesn't require constant vigilance. He kissed her briefly, then was gone again, pulled back into the complex machinery of war and strategic response that was his world. The intelligence that Valentina had provided gave Franco something he hadn't possessed before, the ability to be proactive rather than reactive. He positioned his people in locations where the Versiani strikes were anticipated. He reinforced vulnerable operations. He established surveillance networks that would alert him the moment any of the planned attacks began to materialize. What happened next was unusual in the world of organized crime. Instead of open warfare, there was negotiation. Alexei Popov, the Russian leader who had coordinated the entire assault, arrived in Boston personally expecting to find Franco's organization in disarray. Instead, he discovered that every contingency he'd planned for had been anticipated and countered. Every strike that his people attempted to execute was met with resistance, positioned precisely where it needed to be. The negotiation happened in a private restaurant in the North End, a space controlled by neutral parties who had brokered similar discussions in the past. Franco and Alexei Popov met across a table laden with untouched food, their conversation conducted in the carefully measured tones of two powerful men who recognized that continued conflict would be mutually destructive. "You're more resourceful than I anticipated," Popov said in Russian, his accent thick, but his intention clear. "You're more ambitious than you should have been," Franco replied in English. "Expanding into territory that has established protections requires more than organizational zeal. It requires understanding the landscape you're entering. I have information suggesting that your organization is vulnerable," Popov countered. "You had information," Franco corrected. Past tense. "The woman who translated your intercepted communications for me understands Russian military dialect better than your people understand operational security. Your every plan was visible to me before you executed it." Popov's expression hardened, but he recognized the reality of the situation. His assault had failed before it had begun. The Ravellini organization remained intact, their operations uncompromised, their leadership secure. Continuing to press forward would only result in losses that couldn't be absorbed. "What do you propose?" Popov asked after a silence that stretched across minutes. "Withdrawal," Franco said simply. "Your organization focuses on territories where you don't conflict with my interests. Versiani family concentrates on operations outside New England. In exchange, you receive a payment that compensates for the time and resources you've invested. Everyone survives. Everyone profits. Nobody declares victory because the terms are designed so that both parties understand mutual respect. Pragmatism won. Popov accepted the terms because they represented the best outcome available given the circumstances. Within 48 hours, the Russian organization had begun dismantling their Boston operations. The threat that had dominated Franco's attention for weeks suddenly dissipated, not through destruction, but through negotiated capitulation. Franco returned to the safe house on the 23rd of December, with the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from navigating between life and death, and choosing to preserve both. He found Valentina in the library, exactly where she'd been when he'd left. She looked up from the translation work she'd been completing, and her expression shifted into something that resembled relief. "It's over?" she asked. "It's resolved," Franco said. "Which is better than over. Over implies casualties and destruction. Resolution implies survival and adaptation." He moved to the window and stood there, looking out at the snow that had begun falling across the landscape. December was transitioning into something colder, darker, but the snow created the illusion of purity and renewal. "I need to offer you something," Franco said without turning from the window. "A choice. A real choice. Not something constrained by circumstances or obligation. You can leave. I'll provide you with $250,000. New documents if you want them. Complete financial support for whatever life you want to build. Or you can stay and continue building what we've started here." "And if I leave?" Valentina asked. "Then I wish you well and I disappear from your life," Franco said. "Roberto will ensure your safety. You'll never worry about the Versiani or any other organizational threat. You'll be free." Valentina stood and moved to the window beside him. She looked at the snow falling across the landscape and understood that she was at a crossroads that genuinely offered two paths forward. "I don't want to leave," she said finally. "I'm choosing to stay. But not because I feel obligated. Because I want to." Franco turned to her then. "Then we rebuild," he said, together. Over the next 3 months, life reconstructed itself into a different configuration. Franco re-established Valentina in her original apartment in Boston, though with significantly enhanced security systems. She resumed her translation work, but now with occasional consulting assignments from Franco's organization when sensitive documents required expertise that nobody else possessed. Roberto developed a particular respect for Valentina that transcended his professional loyalty to Franco. He began checking in on her periodically, ensuring that she had everything she needed while Franco attended to organizational matters that demanded his attention. Valentina reconnected with her father Thomas, visiting him in Connecticut once monthly. Their relationship deepened through conversations that finally addressed the fundamental abandonment that had shaped her childhood. Thomas introduced her to extended family that she'd never known existed. People who had been kept at a distance because of the protective barriers that he and Lucia had constructed. By late spring, approximately 6 months after the resolution of the war with Versiani, Franco and Valentina returned to St. Anthony's. It was a Tuesday evening, which had become their ritual time. They entered together and moved to the prayer section where they had first experienced the recognition that had altered both their lives. They knelt side by side, and together they recited the prayer in Sicilian. Franco's voice moved beneath Valentina's, creating harmony that was both spiritual and emotional. When they finished, they sat together in silence, understanding that they had created something genuine from circumstances that should have been irrevocable. The prayer continued to protect them, not through supernatural intervention, but through the connection it represented. They had both been separated from their families, isolated by history and circumstance, carrying spiritual inheritance that they didn't fully understand. In meeting each other, they had reconnected with that inheritance and claimed it not as obligation, but as choice. Life moved forward with Valentina and Franco existing in a relationship that defied conventional categories. They weren't married, but they were committed. They didn't live together, but they shared their lives. They moved through a world of danger and violence and organizational complexity, but they maintained spaces where vulnerability was permitted and intimacy was nurtured. By autumn, they had established routines that accommodated both Franco's operational demands and Valentina's need for independence. She had become a trusted consultant to his organization, her linguistic expertise proving invaluable for navigating international operations and negotiations. But she maintained her own translation business, her own identity separate from Franco's world. The prayer that Lucia Marino had preserved across decades of diasporic distance continued to circulate through their lives. It had survived immigration and abandonment and deliberate severance, emerging in the mouth of a woman who didn't fully understand its origin until she met the man whose family had created it generations before she was born. In the end, they had both discovered what that prayer had promised all along, that protection came through connection, that family persisted across distance and time, and that love could exist alongside danger when both parties chose vulnerability over self-preservation. They had found in each other what they'd both been searching for their entire lives, recognition from another person who understood what it meant to carry history that belonged to you whether or not you had requested it,